Hello and welcome back. Thank you, Thuli and Simon, for this provocative discussion. There's still a lot to say. I remember in a discussion on the future of museums last year, I think it was Elaine Gurion who said that democracy stands at the intersection of decolonizing and decarbonizing. Continuing our discussion on the ethical commitment of museums to act for the common good and the level of activism or politics or ethics, as Simon just said, they may engage in, we now move the discussion to the most crucial predicament of the planet, climate emergency. Climate change is much more than simply an environmental or scientific concern. It impacts on all aspects of social, cultural, political, and economic life, including museums. Most importantly, climate change is a human-caused crisis, and if it can be reversed, it should be human-caused again. So how can museums and their people contribute to this global challenge and become leaders in its reversal? First word that comes to mind is collaboration, or symbiosis, as our next speaker so eloquently defines. We're very excited to host as our first keynote for session 2, an inspiration in the field, Lucia Pietroiusti, founder of the General Ecology project at Serpentine Galleries in the UK, who will present a talk on having a sense of purpose, museums and the environment. Lucia, please.
Hello, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you so much all for being here. I will begin by making a homage and in some sense dedicating this and every other talk I'm probably going to be giving for the next foreseeable future to two figures who both left us a couple of weeks ago in the same week and who were incredibly important, certainly to me as artists, as people who I've known for the better part of an entire life and whose sort of transition from human to more than human beings now that they are amongst our dead is, I think, a really important moment of reflection, both to think about their work and to think about the influence of their work on thinking, including on thinking about sort of the intersections of art and the environment. Ital Adnan, whose burning geometrical suns you see here, for whom Mount Tamalpais, the mountain that she could see from the windows of her home in Sausalito in California, was an incredibly important kind of interlocutor. She called it a best friend, a more than human being with whom she shared decades of her life and who reoccurs over and over and over in her paintings, the same geometrical shape, as though by painting it, she was having some kind of ongoing conversation and you really get a sense of mutual becoming. So I found this really beautiful image from the installation of her show at the Serpentine, and not a sequence of images about Mount Tamalpais, but I find that there's something so powerful about the burning of these suns into the surface of the canvas that really made me think differently about our interrelations with more than human beings. And then so sort of strange and terrible that Jimmy Durham, another artist who has an incredibly important relationship with more than human beings, with the animacy of stone, for example. Both of these artists had a very strong sense of how we exist in history. We exist within the struggles and the kind of contingencies of history. In the case of Jimmy Durham, he had decades of activism in civil rights and the rights of Native American peoples in the USA. In the case of Ital Adnan, her move to California was actually as a direct result of her publishing a very scathing book about the violence during the Lebanese Civil War. And so these two artists, I think one of the things that I realized by them kind of dying within days of each other was that they share the sense that we are really implicated in history, and that at the same time as we're implicated in history, we are implicated in universe, in planet, in interplanetary things, in ecologies that exceed us by both being sort of microscopic within us, being enormous within the notion of a sort of organism that is the planet. Even more enormous still if we think about interplanetary ecology, and that are enormous also in deep time. So the rootedness of our experience and at the same time the kind of oceanic fact of our existence are the two things that just came up as really sort of vibrant in experiencing them and their work again with a sense of sort of whilst saying goodbye in a way. But what I was going to, this is just a sort of a few minutes stolen from the talks that I was going to propose to you, which was actually just quite I suppose, a straightforward consideration of a few of the projects that I've been involved with over the last while, trying to sort of look at them and describe them to you from the point of view of the notion of a sense of purpose for an art institution. And I think that in this sense, what I'm sort of proposing to you not responds, but sort of echoes in some ways, some of the conversations that have been happening up to this point. So if you look at, well, you can start from any direction really, but if you look at a mission statement or a business plan of any organization, whether that is a museum or not, and you do a search and you find the word sustainability and the word resilience, you will more often than not realize that what those statements are actually referring to is far from planetary sustainability, far from sort of the resilience of, say, the countries and peoples at the front line of climate breakdown, and much more specifically about the sustainability and resilience of that very organization. So it's almost never to do with actually having a sense of the environment, the planet, our interconnection and interrelation, and our responsibilities towards each other and towards that sort of more than human context within which we exist and on which we are all dependent. So one of the things that happened, I'm a curator, by the way. One of the things that happened I was in 2018, the curator of public programs at the Serpentine galleries, which meant responsible for time-based really things, whether they be discursive across disciplines or performative or film-based and so on. And then I left for a brief period of time. I had a child, which is, one of the most cliche versions of coming into a sense of the environmental that you can exist. But there is a very deep relationship that you have with a being that has sort of radically unknowable ways of communicating or of needing, and that develops another sense. It develops another sense internally. And it brought me back to co-curating in 2014 the Extinction Marathon, together with our artistic director at the Serpentine, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, and with the artist Gustav Metzger, who really insisted on us curating a festival on the subject of the extinction of species, but also languages, customs, and so on, and what was at stake. And I remember very clearly having the sense that that conversation had not finished in 2015 as the event drew to a close, but that rather we should continue to sort of press on it. I let that go, had a baby, this other kind of embodied and fleshed feeling came up, and started to write a project as I returned to the Serpentine called the General Ecology Project, which would try and really look at those words, sustainability and resilience. I say this with a great amount of hindsight, because it's obviously much easier to see it now than at the time. But the intention was really to try and draw together some of the elements within the Serpentine's infrastructure, the way that we worked, the way that we worked together, the way that we worked with other organizations, be they art or non-art, really sort of foster those interactions and those encounters, but also try and draw together from those things and from our kind of public activities and public messagings and public outreach projects and long-term projects and so on, really try and draw together any aspect that had some kind of connection with the environmental. And general ecology was called general because it had to specifically, it had to do with thinking about ecology in general, so the widest possible understanding of the environmental and the ecological, the earthly, the more than human, and so on. And thinking about generalizing ecology, so taking some of those principles, it's kind of a cybernetic throwback, taking some of those principles from ecological principles and really trying to sort of look at them from an organizational standpoint and from a system standpoint. And then it tried to do more than that, in the sense of like, how do you actually get an institution to shift its sense of purpose ever so slightly? so that it can be confident in the fact that if it dedicates itself to its discipline, but also to causes such as environmental justice and environmental balance, that would actually be a much more resilient and effective way of ensuring one's endurance as time went on. And not only that, it's sort of a win-win situation, because all of a sudden you're more resilient with times that pass. And so you're attending to that initial notion of resilience. And also you're contributing, hopefully positively, to some kind of notion of thrivability, which would be a sort of repair version of sustainability, some kind of notion of an ideal towards planetary sort of environmental justice and environmental balance. So the way that I went about that is just literally taking the agency that I had and just putting it in the place where I felt that it needed to be. Transforming the public programs department into the general ecology department to ensure kind of resilience, a structural transformation and a resilience of that kind of dedication into the institution beyond, let's say, an individual's tenure in that institution. And then started to program things like The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish, together with Filipa Ramos, a very seductive, very charming, very kind of multidisciplinary, very, I would say, like, I want to say sexy, a set of programs that looked at more than human consciousness. And what's more compelling than thinking about consciousness of plants and consciousness of microbes and intelligence across species and beings? And that sort of fostered I heard an echo. That sort of fostered a sense of a community of audiences around the Serpentine that really sort of reflected back an image to the institution as one that had a sort of stake in or some kind of commitment to the environmental. That then prompts a very interesting challenge. Does the institution stand up to that image, or does it hide itself behind, let's say, easily made PR statements that sort of hide? Does it start to have an honest conversation about its own relationship with the environment? It's an open question. But what happened with the Serpentine is actually quite remarkable, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have been involved in all of this, is that as the anniversary of the Serpentine was approaching 2020, that year that we shall never celebrate, the decision was made that we would dedicate one of the milestone programs of the anniversary project not to celebrating 50 years backwards, but actually to try and take responsibility over 50, why not 5,000 years into the future? What is the responsibility for looking ahead instead of backwards? And so we came up with a project called Back to Earth, which invited many, many, many artists to propose something that was simultaneously an artwork and an environmental campaign or initiative or prototype or intervention. So we left it really loose. And we found that actually so many of the artists with whom we work had, either as part of their practice or to the side of their practice, never being considered part of their artistic practice, some kind of involvement, commitment, passion, dedication to something that had to do with the environment or environmental justice or balance. So we began by mapping the projects. I mean, this is very systems-based. There's much more beautiful slides that I could show you, but we started by mapping the project onto something like this, like what is the aim of, where do they need to reach, these artworks, these projects? And then we moved on to something like vectors around, what is the sort of, where are the impacts, whether we can measure them or not. And for me, that's really important. Are the impacts to reach the public, as wide as possible public? Are the impacts desired to change systems, change policy, change education, change a piece of legislation? Are they actually commitment to particular places? Like an artist who might say, well, I'm opening the Center for Agroforestry over here, and this is what I want you to support. Is it an artwork? And we would go, it's okay. Like those silos are sort of breaking down under the logic of Back to Earth. Or are they speculation artworks in the ways that you would sort of recognize them perhaps more immediately, that imagine possible future different paradigms, perhaps post-anthropocentric paradigms? And then, so here are some images from those 4, let's say, vectors, cooking sections who look to change the food industry through regenerative agriculture. Tabitha Rezer, who is opening a center for the arts and sciences of the earth, the body and the sky in French Guyana. Revital Cohen and Tor van Balen, who propose a kind of interplanetary origin story, and a piece like I Love You Earth on billboards throughout the UK by Yoko Ono, which is obviously kind of aimed at public dissemination. So in the last minute, I just wanted to talk about the discourse of the environment and where it needs to be. So with the benefit of hindsight, I would love to say that general ecology was dedicated from the beginning to environmental justice and environmental balance. That's how it makes sense to me now, because of a number of reasons that I don't have time to sort of describe today, but a number of reasons that have to do with who actually is the anthropos in anthropocentrism, and the fact that it is actually a notion that was born at the same time and in fact dependent on a system of colonization and extraction. So those things are really clear to me now after years of research. And in the last 30 seconds, I'll just mention that trying to dedicate a big chunk of the project to the notion of climate justice and the fact that much of more often than not, the agenda of the environment doesn't recognize and reckon with the fact that it is those countries and those nations that are least responsible for climate emissions that are actually at the front line of climate breakdown, and that therefore the discourse of justice is absolutely fundamental to be placed front and center in an environmental discourse. We co-curated a festival called Sensing the Planet, which really had to do with trying to recognize the ways that the ecologies that we know are in fact ecologies of empire, and trying to move that into some kind of liberation planetary feeling. And then from that, moving on to trying to think about forms of futurism and organizing as versions of one another, futurism as organizing and organizing as futurism. And then focusing on the notion of ecocide and the justice, the paradigm that is afforded within the notion of ecocide that has kind of justice implications. I think that's probably as much as I have time to tell you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for saying so many things in such a short time. One thing that comes to mind listening to you is I remember Nick Merriman last year from the Horniman that she kept telling us how small we are as people in time and in this planet, and how big, how small the Anthropocene even is compared to the life of the planet. And in fact, something I really like that you're saying as well is it's more effective to give positive messages out about the environment, about the planet, rather than the destructive ones, in order to change the psychology of the people. I wanted to ask you, when you decided, let's say, to have this twist, this turn, this focus on ecology, how central or peripheral has this been in the general programming of the Serpentine?
It's changed over the years, I have to say. The story of the General Ecology Project is that it was born kind of intentionally small. It still actually operates at an incredibly tiny budget. But over the years, and thanks to many external factors, and I should also say that it probably rests on the shoulders of decades and decades and decades of environmental practitioners and activists and artists and everybody else, it absolutely didn't invent anything except trying to sort of bake it into the notion, the really DNA of the organization. There was definitely a kind of coming to consciousness at really mainstream level of mainstream art environment level of sort of the environmental around obviously my story is very biased, but around the time that the Lithuanian pavilion was shown in Venice, there were thousands of people that were coming out crying from this. And I was really thinking, I was joking at the time, the art world is having a nervous breakdown and I don't understand why. But actually, I think it was just this moment of like great cathartic sort of feeling of something that we perceived but hadn't quite been willing to pay attention to. So returning to the Serpentine from that experience, and not just because of the award, but just because of the groundswell of interest that came out of not only that project, but various projects that year, then gave it a lot more space within the organization to try and develop something. And that's how something like Back to Earth, which is kind of much more of a front and center project than general ecology even now. That's how those things were able to come. And as we move forward, what we're working towards now, what we're working towards now is like, how do you take those senses of purposes, which for the Serpentine are very clearly like self-defined as technology, community, and ecology, how you take those three and you actually sort of structurally transform the organization for it to have kind of perennial dedication to those things, and how does it then go about doing that? So we're in a transition moment for sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucia. You can still write questions for Lucia to maybe answer later or contact her in the future. I have one more last question regarding, again, the project mapping the artworks that fall under environmental justice. Who did the selection, is the question by Eleni. And did the artworks reach the public, and what was the reaction?
I didn't understand the question, I'm sorry.
Who did the selection for the artworks, and who did they reach the public, and what was the reaction?
But for which artworks?
In the last project on mapping the artworks that fall under environmental justice, that's the question.
Okay, I'm not sure I understand from the question whether Back to Earth or Sensing the Planet, but in either case, I wouldn't call it selections. I'm hesitant. But the invitations were made by the curatorial group. In the case of Sensing the Planet, the whole event was live streamed, and we did put some of the films online for a period of time. Some of them are in the public domain, so they can always be seen. And in the case of something like Back to Earth, they will manifest over time, whether online or through an exhibition next year and so on. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. And I have one more last question for you, more of an anecdotal. How did you come up with the title, The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish?
I'm my psychoanalyst. It was really, so I watched The Blue Planet. There's a pufferfish that makes these like beautiful sand circles. And I just got stuck trying to figure out in what shape, because the fish is so small and the circle's so big, it's impossible that the fish is imagining this gorgeous painting and then reproducing it, right? So the shape of that circle in the mind of that fish is not a circle at all. It's probably like a series of movements. It's like a whole different, so that led Philippa and I down a conversation. She's not my psychotherapist, she's the co-curator of the project, but I ended up talking about this in therapy, and then Philippa and I ended up sort of developing this question around more than human consciousness, and how these translations or these shifts sort of bring us into a place of like a new paradigm for sure, but also a paradigm that is part unknowable, part infleshed, part sort of instinctive, and so on. So
true. Well, thank you very much, Lucia. Thank you so much for this presentation. We hope to see you live in Greece one day.
Thank you so much.
We say goodbye to you.